The thing I always found most compelling about the Targaryens was not their perceived supremacy, or the exceptionalism that comes from that, but how at the end of the day they're just people. They've been elevated, but in reality they have the capacity to do good just like the rest of us. And they do that about as often as they do awful things. But as individuals, wherever they fall on the scale of gray that exists between good and bad, the power they inherit at birth always makes it matter, and sometimes leads to far-reaching consequences that disproportionately affect others. The death of Luke Velaryon at the end of House of the Dragon's first season wasn't the moment when the Dance of the Dragons became inevitable, but it changed the shape of the conflict in ways that set up everything that happens in the second season. I suppose you could make a good argument that a civil war was always inevitable in a family that has exclusive access to the most powerful weapons known to man, but that's not where the show decided to focus its energy. Siblings, cousins, and extended family members often fight, and sometimes bully each other. But what happens when the kid who was bullied for being the only family member without a dragon goes out to claim the most ferocious and formidable killing machine in the world? Things can escalate quickly from there. Luke's death made the succession crisis personal for the Blacks and became something they had to answer for. This led to the beheading of Prince Jaehaerys in the season premiere, and the split between Rhaenyra and Daemon, putting him on a path to confront his past, and the idea of prophecy that has driven so many of his family's decisions throughout their history. Which, the fact that this is also a way they're not like us is something I think needs to be stressed. The sole reason they are the last remaining Dragonlord family from Old Valyria is that Daenerys Targaryen dreamed of the doom that destroyed it before it happened, and she was able to convince her father to relocate the family. When a prophetic dream is the thing that took your family from inconsequential to being the conquering rulers of the Seven Kingdoms, I imagine it changes the way you look at such things. I like to think of young Targs running around saying that they can't eat their vegetables or go to sleep because they saw they weren't supposed to in a dream. But it's when they grow up that things get a lot more complicated. With George R.R. Martin's blessing, the show also introduced the prophecy from Aegon the Conqueror last season, adding another layer of motivation, and also a surprising amount of ripple effects that spread through the current season. Pretty soon after this was introduced, I saw several people who were excited because it would be fun to look at periods of the family history through a new lens. Essentially, this wasn't just a way to reframe their conquest, but it brings up questions about different events and whether they were influenced by the prophecy. Were the characters involved caught in the grip of A Song of Ice and Fire in the same way that Viserys and increasingly Rhaenyra are? A Targaryen being obsessed with prophecy wasn't a new thing, but a secret one that was the catalyst for Aegon's conquest certainly had the potential to reinvigorate things that we already thought we knew. The show made that essential to its telling by giving it a direct influence over Alicent's decision to put Aegon on the throne. The Green Council probably would have done this either way, but it gave her, as someone who's not Targaryen, but rather a vehement follower of the Faith of the Seven, who might otherwise be unmoved by prophecy and Targaryen dreams, a justification for her actions. The intention was to make her more than the villain that Rhaenyra says history will remember her as, a cold queen grasping for power and then defeated. When really, as we saw, she was just a kid. She got sucked up into this. She made a lot of mistakes along the way, which is completely relatable. To bring things back to Luke, this season opened with a call for a son, so it's fitting that it ends with one too. The original target, Aemond, spent most of the season feeling invincible, but we saw that come to an end in episode 7. In response, he decided to destroy Sharp Point, which is the castle of House Bar Emmon, who supports Rhaenyra and is pretty much on his way back to King's Landing from Dragonstone. Probably to keep a handle on the budget, they cut this scene a little strangely. It opens with him looking at the destruction from a distance. Later, through other characters, we find out that he basically just torched it. So what we saw at the beginning was him taking a pause to enjoy what he had just accomplished. It's pretty dark, and this is the path that he's been on since he accidentally killed Luke. I say accidentally, but he was obviously doing something pretty stupid to set that whole situation off. But that earned him the title of Kinslayer, and further isolated him from his family throughout the season. One Eye wasn't the only potential Dragon Rider child who felt left out. On Rhaenyra's side, Rhaena was given an egg at birth that never hatched. She spends most of the episode pursuing the wild dragon named Sheepstealer. I heard some complaints about the fact that she just left her armed escort at the end of the last episode, and I thought she just dipped out for a minute and would rejoin them eventually. But it looks like the complainers were right. She just took off as soon as she left the Eyrie. The fact that Jane Eyre made a point of saying she'd send good men to escort them made this seem a little off. Which is a shame, since it's otherwise an exciting development for a character that we know has languished in her perceived inability to contribute to the cause. By the end, we see that she has a face-to-face with the wild beast that is notably different from when Adam and Seasmoke first met. We don't know how it plays out, but you'd imagine she'll finally be a dragon rider at some point. This is a pretty big change from the book, where a different character that the show never introduced claimed this dragon in a different way that I won't get into, since that might still happen next season. The thing that set that rider apart from the others was that she was a brown-skinned commoner who didn't have any immediate connections to the Targaryen bloodline. Nothing that you could point to like you have with Adam, Ulf, or Hugh. I guess now is as good a time as any to mention that most of what I've talked about so far is either additional information the book didn't provide, or stuff the show completely made up itself. My thinking is that in the beginning, the writers set out to write the show as a possible version of the truth you never really get from reading, because it's presented as a history book based on conflicting accounts years after these things happened. There's bias, the contributors have different personalities that influence how they see things. Not knowing exactly what happened is baked into what makes the book entertaining. When they shifted from trying to hit the bullet points in order to get all the pieces in place like they did in the first season, and started to flesh out the characters, which I think was a smart move considering there isn't much there, then they sort of have to follow those characters where they take them. You'll probably hear some complaints about that, some of which might be valid, but I would say if you're interested in good TV, then take them with a grain of salt, because the fake history book format is not the same as the main A Song of Ice and Fire series, where you get great characterization by knowing what the POV characters are thinking. Regardless of how this played out, I think what's most interesting about it is that Rhaena's interests aren't lined up with what she was sent there to do. It makes sense for her to want to claim a dragon, and to think that this will be a big boost, since she doesn't know about the dragon seeds, but she was also given a pretty important job. So if she did ditch the kids and then returns to Dragonstone on Dragonback, I'm not entirely sure how Rhaenyra would react to that. I brought up Aemond's scene first because the destruction of Sharp Point is an immediate consequence of the sowing of the dragon seeds, which in a way is the conclusion of this season. The end of episode 7 could have been the season finale, while most of what we see in episode 8 is table setting for season 3. A big part of that is Tywin Lannister's bargaining with the Triarchy, or if you prefer, the Kingdom of the Three Daughters. We see him travel to Essos to meet with the leaders from the free cities of Myr, Lys, and Tyrosh. These were all colonial outposts of the Valyrian freehold when it was at its height. They're called the Free Cities because they were given limited self-rule over their own affairs by the Dragon Lords. We were introduced to the Triarchy in Season 1, and they were the source of one of its most hilarious bits, with Viserys being unable to stop hearing about them and the conflict in the Stepstones. If you remember in Episode 3, Tywin was the one who interrupted the royal hunt for Aegon's second name day to bring it up. That was our introduction to the Green's current Master of Coin, and he's managed to stick around ever since without us getting to know too much about him. He's always been a little strange, or at least reserved, but here he's a complete fish out of water. I don't think it's going out on a limb to say that he's probably not the best man for the job, but he does manage to do what Aemond commanded him to. After a round of negotiations, he ends up promising the Triarchy the Stepstones. Of course, he needs their ships to get rid of the blockade, and they want control of the Stepstones so that they can charge people the simple tax to pass through that Corlys was so worried about at the beginning of the series. Tywin has no choice but to agree, so he does. But there is one catch. He has to win over the commander of their fleet. They say the sailors are fiercely loyal to Shirako Lohar, who the YouTuber Abigail Thorne plays, and that they won't fight if he doesn't lead them. Lohar is an imposing figure who tells Tylan, while always getting his name a little wrong, that she doesn't sail with anyone who can't best her in what turns out to be a mud wrestling match. This makes it seem like the show borrowed some from the Tyroshi character Racalio Rindoon, which Laenor mentioned as a flamboyant character in the East in a conversation with Rhaenyra in Season 1. There isn't a very detailed description of Shirako in the book, other than he's a Lyseni admiral, but Rindoon is mentioned as having a mud wrestling match with a different character a little later in the story. Either way, their match is robust, and after getting beat on some, Tylan does what he has to do to earn Shirako's respect. You'll notice that the Triarchy referred to Shirako with male pronouns, but then also see that she's a woman. I think that it's supposed to show that the men accept her, but don't necessarily want to be led by a woman. But we'll have to see if they explain that any further. Sometimes when a show introduces a new character in a season finale, it can feel like a distraction. But it's always nice to visit different places and be reminded that Westeros exists in a world with multiple cultures. Shirako is fun and provides a nice way to lighten things up. The offer to eat the flesh of his enemies and the proposal to impregnate wives after proving his virility puts Tylan in some funny situations. This also gets into the nature of the compromises you have to make to undermine your enemies in times of war. This deal undoes all those years of fighting that Daemon and the Sea Snake were involved in, but it's also plainly bad for the people who live in King's Landing. The new fleet will be sailing to clash with Corlys and the blockade, so we should have a good idea of what the Blacks will be up against at the beginning of next season. One thing about the Triarchy that makes them a good choice for this is that they've already experienced conflict involving dragons in the Stepstones. But I don't think anyone at this meeting, including Tylan, is aware of the new riders that have been thrown into the mix. It's an unholy alliance for the Greens, and the Blacks' army of bastards feels like it might be one for them. I went into some of the detail about why this is so unprecedented in my last video, something that Jace will never let us forget. And Ulf kind of takes center stage to highlight how this might take some getting used to, and could possibly go terribly wrong. He offends Jace before he knows who he is, and then proceeds to gush over him and their shared Dragon Rider status, which inadvertently offends him all over again when he finds out. He doesn't have a filter, which the Highborns aren't used to, and this is on full display when the Queen hosts her new riders for dinner, where his lack of manners, which also makes him super entertaining to watch, has everyone else at the table squirming in their seats. At one point, Rhaenyra suggests that a knight would comport themselves in front of their queen, and he offers the quick retort, "You better make me a knight then." They just don't know what to expect, and Rhaenyra tells Corlys as much. He passes up on another chance to be like, "Oh yeah, this guy Adam is my son, and maybe we ought to legitimize him and his brother," before he points out the important part is that the dragons now have riders, and urges her to act swiftly. She mentions that she hoped they might work as a deterrent, but quickly sees his reasoning. I guess this is a nod to her being somewhat sincere when she told the seeds the same thing before she let Vermithor start roasting them. This is the most counsel we've seen him provide in his role as Hand, and it all seems like solid advice based on his experience. Her current roster of riders isn't exactly thrilled to hear that the plan involves killing innocents, which I'm not sure Corlys was actually advocating for, but they're willing to do what's asked of them. I guess I should say everyone but Jace is put off by the idea, which kinda stands out since he likely won't be flying into battle. The Sea Snake probably isn't wrong when he says Aemond won't stop at Sharp Point though. It also stands out that the original plan would give the new riders all of 2 days to learn how to ride and to learn the commands before sending them off to wreak havoc. To go against Vhagar, the plan would almost have to be for these three to take her on. Corlys tells the queen that his men are ready, that they serve her, and that they're on their way to rejoin the blockade. He mentions that his ship is as good as new and that he changed the name. The Sea Snake was a testament to his glory, so he renamed it the Queen Who Never Was as a tribute to Rhaenys. Later, when they're getting ready to leave, he pulls Alan aside for a conversation. He says he wants to set out on good terms with his first mate, and essentially reveals that he can't understand why Alan isn't grateful for this great opportunity he's giving him. This hits a nerve, and we see Alan show emotion for the first time when he tells his father how difficult it was for him growing up spurned as a bastard, struggling to survive while he would see his father, who remember was the richest man in the Seven Kingdoms at one point, and his legitimate son Laenor living it up. This is something I wondered about because in the book their mother is around, and it seems like she made a decent life for herself and her boys. When they come forward as potential dragon seeds, the cover story is that they're Laenor's bastards, which isn't as controversial since he's dead, but also not something everyone believes since people knew he wasn't interested in women. It's always been a little strange since they're right there in plain view and grew up on the docks where he spends so much time. And it turns out to be more brutal than expected when you hear Alan explain what it was like for him in the show's version of the story. Just think about having to work for this person who never had any interest in being your dad while his other family was alive. It was satisfying to see him be able to get this out, and I really liked the line, "suddenly to scatter the crumbs of your favor." And it was a really good scene all the way around. Another scene that got to a similar place was the one in Aegon's room. He asked Orwell for a little rum to ease his pain before Larys shows up to tell him that they have to leave King's Landing. Based on his attempt to cross the room last episode, this doesn't sound like something he's up for. The Clubfoot tells him about Rhaenyra's new advantage, and that Aemond burnt the town of Sharp Point down when he found out. Aegon is still the king, so he doesn't initially understand why he wouldn't just push his brother out instead of running away. When Larys questions what he would do when Rhaenyra descends on King's Landing with her 7 dragons after he locks up Vhagar's rider, it all clicks into place. Larys has moved Harrenhal's gold reserves to the Iron Bank in Braavos, so the idea is to go somewhere to hide while Aemond and Rhaenyra destroy themselves. When the people have had enough of their fighting and their armies are spent, Aegon can return and be welcomed as his father's true heir. If for nothing else, it's a good idea, because if he stays, Aemond will probably kill him. But as Larys is explaining the plan, the king lays out all the cons of living as he is now, and you can see why he spends his days in the depths of despair. It's a great scene that makes me hope that they won't just completely disappear for a season or a big chunk of time after we see them riding away from the city at the end of the episode. The show turned him into an interesting character, and so it really landed when he threw out the name Aegon the Realm's Delight, because we know that's what they called Rhaenyra in the book when she was still young. His mother is also thinking of leaving and floats the idea to Helaena. Before they can get too far into their conversation, Aemond bursts in and tries to do exactly what Corlys brought up when he was talking to Rhaenyra. He tries to compel her to join the fight on Dreamfire. When she says she won't burn anyone, he grabs her by the arm and says it wasn't a request, and sounds more than a little unhinged when he shouts, "They elevated commoners to dragon lords, which is a sin that must be punished." Alicent intervenes and eventually gets him to back off. They have a heated exchange with neither side holding back their contempt for the other, while both landing blows that must surely sting. He says it's all her fault for being a weak leader. She says he wants to rule the 7 kingdoms but rains ruin and death upon its small folk when he's been insulted. They're essentially talking past each other at this point, and after he leaves, she goes to see Orwell and tells him she needs to quietly arrange passage for her to leave the city. Initially, it seems like she's trying to run away with Helaena, but we find out later that she's trying to get to Dragonstone. When I was going back to look at this scene with Aemond and Alicent, I had it paused for a minute, and I noticed when she's confronting him, he's turned away with his eye patch and scarf facing her. It made me wonder if he can even see her from that angle, and it's a nice touch because that defining moment for him, losing an eye to gain a dragon, is on full display and is almost like a shield. He actually seems to listen to his mother, though, even though whenever he's given the chance, he always kind of talks down about her. And I think this highlights a bit of a turn because what's been driving him for most of the season is that he doesn't need anyone else. They had their chance, and now he'll just take care of things himself. Watching this scene makes you realize it's all a bit sadder than that, though. In relation to Luke, no one even ever asked him about that on screen. They just assumed that he was a nutjob and took his chance to violently kill a kid because he has the biggest, baddest dragon and could. He pushes everyone away to be sure, but they also are happy about it because they don't want to have anything to do with him because they're afraid of him. This is something Aegon touched on in his conversation with Larys. And so while Aemond is definitely squarely in the villain camp, he burnt down a city of innocent people in this episode. He's also reaching out for help to his family. He tells his mother it's not just their rule. They're going to come here and kill us all. Don't you want to help me make sure we survive? And they still don't want to have anything to do with him. This is him going from something closer to a god to a regular person again when the balance of power shifts. He might wrap it up as a sin that calls for punishment, but when the new Dragon Riders turn things around completely, it put Rhaenyra in the place where she's becoming invincible and taking her closer to a god turn, which I think we saw all over her face during the sowing. Later, when he goes to talk to Helena alone, he opens by saying, "Sister, we share the same blood, you and I." This is something he planned out and words he chose carefully. And it's him trying to make himself human in her eyes. It shows that for the first time since he mounted Vhagar, he's legitimately scared. And when he tries to connect with his sister, who isn't even a little interested, she not only reveals that she knows what he did to Aegon at Rook's Rest, but also that she's seen his death. She says he'll be swallowed up by the God's Eye and never seen again. For the reasons I mentioned earlier, he has to at least entertain the idea that this might be true. And it makes you wonder what he'll do next after all attempts to connect with his family have failed, and he might just die either way. This stood out to me in how direct it was. She just comes out and says it. Her prophecies in the past were more like riddles, so I'm not sure if this is something we're supposed to pick up on. Either way, I like seeing these two paired up because she talks with her mother about how she was happier before she was the queen and just a normal person. And she's bonded with one of the other formidable dragons that are out there, but chooses not to use the power that affords her, just flatly refusing to burn anyone. Another guy who has death on his mind is Criston Cole. After he gets called out for sniffing the Dowager Queen's favor, he launches into a philosophical monologue that starts by him explaining to Gwaine that after Alicent saved his life multiple times, she became the beacon he follows. There's also the sex. He doesn't deny that, but his real conflict is related to honor. He ponders whether it's a mist that melts in the morning, which is a good question, and a direct callback to his conversation with Alicent a few episodes back. It's a little bleak for Gwaine, and Criston explains he's all out of philosophy. He used to think using his sword to protect the righteous and dispense justice on the rest was the way to go, but after what they saw when the dragons danced, he's having a hard time believing in anything. He says they're marching to their annihilation, and that dying will be a kind of relief. It's another really good scene, and another example of what this show got really good at this season. I know Aegon sexually assaulted Diana in season 1. I know Aemond deliberately tried to kill his brother. And I know Cole murdered a couple of people, but I can still be right there with them in these scenes. This episode jumps around a lot, which I don't think is ideal since there isn't a lot of payoff. But the last character check-in we have to get through before I can get to the big developments is between Baela and Jace. I had to look this up to make sure because I thought Jace was about 14 or 15 in the book, but then the shows often age some of the characters up, and the first season had so many time jumps that it's hard to keep track. It turns out that show Jace is 6 and 10 and is a bit of a pouty teenager. Baela acknowledges that he's angry, which is something I talked about making sense in my last video, and he repeats the same things he told his mom to her. Her advice is interesting because since he's illegitimate, he holds on to his Dragon Rider status and the trappings of his station as proof that he's better than these other bastards. And that was all before he had Ulf there to prove his point. But she points out that he can sit around and be resentful even though he's not the first highborn person this has ever happened to, or he can go out and prove his worth by his mother's side. It's simple, but she's absolutely right. Alfred Broom finally arrives and gets a little treason-y by suggesting that if Daemon were to declare himself, his men would follow him, which isn't necessarily surprising, but gets interesting because Daemon just sort of brushes it off, because we aren't meant to know where he stands and what he plans to do with this new army yet. But if you think about it, Alfred did say that they needed a king, which is some turncloak type of stuff, and they're both going to have that in the back of their minds from here on out. It seemed like the Heart Tree even called him a traitor. So maybe it's charged up after Daemon spilled Willem Blackwood's blood in front of it. Later, while he's still sleeping in that weirwood bed, Alice Rivers comes to tell him she's on her way to the Godswood. He decides to tag along, and if you'll forgive me for nerding out a little bit, when they approach the tree, there's a freaking green man lurking in the shadows. I didn't have subtitles on the first time I watched it, but definitely saw the antlers right away. And then when I went back, I saw that it said antlered human-shaped clip-clopping and grumbling, and was just like, whoa, since obviously the clip-clopping is from the sound of his hooves. Not to completely derail, but the Order of the Green Men are the guardians of the Isle of Faces, which is in the middle of the lake, the God's Eye, that's not far from Harrenhal. This is such an important place because it's right in the middle of everything. No one ever goes there, and because this is where the Children of the Forest and the First Men signed their peace pact. They carved faces in all the weirwood trees so that the gods could bear witness to their agreement, and the Order of the Green Men was created to guard them. Since they're pretty good at doing that, almost no one who tries to travel to the Isle of Faces ever makes it there. So by this point, no one's even sure they exist anymore. In one of her stories, Old Nan tells Bran that they ride elks and have antlers. And the story Mira tells him about the Night of the Laughing Tree that took place during the famous tourney at Harrenhal that her father Howland Reed attended came after he was able to travel to the Isle and meet with the Green Men. Daemon definitely sees this hooved fella walking by, but then it looks like he can't really trust anything he sees anymore, so he doesn't even mention it. Alice talks a little about how Daemon's time at the castle has changed him, and then asks if he wishes to learn what's given to him. All his life he sought to command his own fate, but today he's ready. She takes his hand and puts it on the tree, which I learned has George R.R. Martin's face on it from watching the making of video after the last episode, and after he touches that, he has a pretty intense vision. In that, he sees a young Brynden Rivers, the three-eyed raven, one of the most mysterious characters in the book, and one of my favorites, which you'll remember as a much older man if you watch Game of Thrones. In the books, he's albino and loses one of his eyes like Aemond, but here he still has both of them. We see an actual three-eyed raven, one that looks similar to the one that we saw in Game of Thrones, materialize from his birthmark in the same shape that gives him his name. Then we see the Night King leading White Walkers, a battlefield with the fallen dragon, puddles on the ground turned red from the blood of the soldiers. Daemon falls into one and is then fully submerged underwater, where he sees a vision of the Red Comet and Daenerys hatching her dragons. Then he sees Rhaenyra wearing the Conciliator's crown sitting on the Iron Throne, and as he approaches her, he hears Helaena say, "It's all a story, and you are but one part in it. You know your part. You know what you must do." This is pretty intense and serves to convince him that he should support Rhaenyra. He can't really discredit her belief in the prophecy now that he's actually seen it. In a way, he has more of a connection to it than her now. Seeing a young blood raven and a green man in the same sequence was a nerdy treat, and I guess I should point out that this is all in the future and includes things we know will happen because we saw them in Game of Thrones. Then it cuts to Helaena, who almost looks like she was remote viewing this stream from above King's Landing. It's an odd transition that I'm not sure I like, but this is where Aemond comes to talk to her alone. I'm gonna have to see where they go with this. I liked all of what happened with Daemon in Harrenhal this season, even if it did feel like he was a little stuck after a few episodes. But this thing that Alice says about fate, and Helaena acting as if the story is already written out. When she tells Aemond he'll die, she talks about it in the past tense. It brings up a lot of questions and almost feels like it's from a different show. I don't want them to stop necessarily, but it all didn't work as much as I wanted it to. The thing about prophecy in this universe is that it doesn't really matter if it comes true. We know that Daemon seeing Daenerys, even though he doesn't know who she is exactly, other than she looks Targaryen and has dragons, isn't so much about the part she plays in the story, but what he does because of believing the prophecy exists. The vision is for him rather than us, if that makes sense. It gets him to the place where he can follow Rhaenyra as his queen, which was something he didn't know if he was capable of doing before he took this trip. This makes for a fantastic reunion when, after getting word from Sir Simon, she travels to Harrenhal to finally confront Daemon. There's a lot going on here. First, I think it's worth noting that this wasn't something she could be compelled to do before she had enough dragons so that she didn't necessarily need Caraxes anymore. I mean, she'll take all dragons, and Caraxes is a fine one, but having 3 more at home emboldened her enough that she was finally ready to face him. Second, I was a little surprised she chose to bring Adam with her instead of Baela. Third, the host Daemon has put together is impressive, and he seems to be back to his old self when you see him interacting with his men. Fourth, how awkward was it when she walked in and no one reacted, like their queen just came through the door unexpectedly. Syrax even perched above to give her the maximum amount of weight she could bring to the table, and I mean, you could hear a pin drop in there. That last part works as a great setup for Daemon to take that very long walk to greet her. It never really seemed like he would go against her, but the way this scene is put together makes it feel like he might. The way they do that little almost headbutt thing they do is a super effective way to bring us back after they've been split up for so long. And the way she steps back to ask who he's sworn to so that everyone can hear him be put to the question was perfect. He speaks in High Valyrian to tell her that he's Team Prophecy now, and oh yeah, winter is coming. And after she says he sounds like her father, he says the realm's only hope is a leader who can unite it, and his brother chose Rhaenyra. So he bends the knee. Everyone else follows his lead. Alfred Broom looks a little shaken, and she warns Daemon to leave her again at his peril. I have to say it lands pretty hard when he finally calls her his queen. And then my favorite part of the whole thing is when he starts to lead the men in the chant. And as she takes it all in, MVP Sir Simon Strong stands off to her side behind her, slightly out of focus, and claps his hands in the best way imaginable. And while that felt like an emotional climax, it's followed up with another big scene before we get to the closing montage that says, okay, this time we really mean it. All the pieces are in place for things to get bonkers next season. Broken down into its respective pieces like I'm doing here, there's a lot of substance packed into this episode. I wouldn't say that it necessarily takes the shape of a satisfying season finale when you put it all together, but I think it's fairly obvious that they had to make some tough decisions when they found out they were only getting 8 episodes to work with. There was a point in episode 7 where I was watching Alicent floating in the water and a great looking scene where I found myself wondering if having to structure this season to hit some major expensive set piecey type events caused problems. I'm not referring to pacing because I think investing the time in developing characters was an improvement this season if you're looking at this as a whole series. Budgetary restrictions affecting structure are different because they present actual restraints. You could say they should have just cut out a bunch of stuff in the early episodes and still got to point X in the story, but I think that's short-sighted. In long-form TV, I want things to happen to characters and I want to watch them react so that when the big moments come, they feel earned and make sense because I'm in tune with what the characters are thinking or what they become when they get there. So after Alicent realized that Aemond was likely to continue burning down the 7 kingdoms on Vhagar, she decided to take a trip to Dragonstone. It felt a little like deja vu because I was like, what? They're really doing this? Just like I did when Rhaenyra went to King's Landing in episode 3. And also, once I got over that and just watched these 2 actors work, I completely understood why the writers wanted to do this. This time the tables are completely turned. My biggest hang-up over Rhaenyra's choice to go talk to Alicent in episode 3 was that I couldn't figure out what her plan to get Alicent on board with killing all of her children would be. This just seemed like something that would have to happen because as long as there are other living replacements, Rhaenyra's claim would always have the potential to be threatened. I felt a little crazy because I kept hearing people saying that collectively we know Rhaenyra would never do that. She would never order the executions of Aegon and his siblings. And I kept thinking it's not really up to her. We'll come back to that, but the first thing I noticed when this scene got going was that Alicent was wearing light blue. It felt like this might be the first time we saw her in anything but green since she arrived at Rhaenyra's wedding in the green dress. I'm not sure if that's the case, but blue is the color she wore in all those scenes they shared before she married Viserys. It's not surprising then that she comes to her as a friend, as if none of the past 20-odd years happened. She talks about how she was raised to believe there was an order to things, and the safe route was to follow the path that was laid out for her. She resented that Rhaenyra was able to exist above that, and never seemed to worry, a freedom she never experienced because she never knew what she wanted. She only knew what was expected of her, and she threw herself into that. So I brought up that scene in the water in episode 7 that's obviously related to her making this decision. But when Rhaenyra interrupts her here to essentially say, "Get to the point, why are you here?" I thought about how that scene was preceded by her pouring her heart out to Orwell while she had him there dressing her wound. Most of this season has been about what she's talking about here. Not being able to count on the people she put her faith in. And we had that great scene where she got pushed out of the Regency first and then the small council altogether. And I don't know. You see her sitting there talking to the Grand Maester and realize that that's really the only person in the world she can talk to. When I look at it like that, it's not all that weird that she's here wearing that blue dress like when they were kids and talking to the person who she's on the other side of a war with like they're still best friends. There's kind of a gotcha moment where Rhaenyra calls her out for taking a lover to remind us just how insufferable Alicent was or can be, and I particularly enjoyed the way she put the words together. "Yes, but you alone made virtue your banner." Eventually, Alicent says she would take Helaena and leave it all behind, and the roles are reversed when Rhaenyra reminds her that it's too late. The situation is different, but the reality is the same. At one point, we see her step away and turn her back and start biting at her nails like she did when she was a girl. The whole thing is heavy and there are no wasted words, and when pressed for why she really came there, Alicent tells her that Aemond will be leaving to join their forces in a few days. If Rhaenyra comes to King's Landing then, Helaena will have the authority to command the guards to throw down their weapons and hand over the city without bloodshed. There's a long beat before the question of Aegon comes up, and she goes through the motions of saying that she believes she can get him to bend the knee before Rhaenyra rejects that outright. In order to end the war, she has to take his head, and she has to do it publicly. That's the price she'll have to pay. A son for a son. And Rhaenyra won't let her leave until she says whether she'll pay it. When she does agree, Rhaenyra delivers the line about the way history will remember her that I already mentioned. And it does feel unbelievably cold to offer up your son. The other option is to continue the war and hope that your entire family doesn't die, or that your war criminal committing son doesn't rule like a tyrant if he's victorious, or I guess pick any of the other possible outcomes that are all pretty bleak when you're dealing with a war that involves a bunch of fire-breathing dragons. I think what's important here is that this is not a place they arrive at easily. There's not a sense of victory hanging over this conversation. They both made real mistakes that helped things get as bad as they are, and they both know that now that things are in motion, all the power that they've been able to collect throughout their entire existence isn't enough to make it stop. Not completely. That's where they leave it. As she walks away, we see the dragon seeds putting on their armor. Even Ulf looks halfway acceptable. There's an emphasis on the score, which sounds amazing. We see the Hightower host marching with Darren flying overhead on his blue dragon to Sarion. Can't really see Alicent's youngest son, but he's there. We see Cragen Stark's army of Greybeards crossing at the Twins. Jason Lannister in his badass looking lion armor coming from the west. Daemon standing in front of Harrenhal, wearing his armor and taking a look at his army. Tyland and Shirako on the Triarchy ships closing in on the blockade. Corlys and Alan on their way to the Queen Who Never Was to join their fleet. Rhaenyra coming face to face with Sheepstealer, and then a mysterious shot of Otto who is locked up somewhere. My initial thought on this was that the Beesberries found him on his way to the Reach and are holding him hostage as a bargaining chip, but it could really be anything in a time of war. He was the architect who helped his grandson usurp the throne, so I can't wait to see what this is all about. Then we see Aegon on his wooden throne sneaking out of the city with Larys in a covered cart filled with birds, and the season ends with a wide outside shot of Alicent looking across the water, contrasted by one of Rhaenyra from behind from the same distance through those racks inside Dragonstone where they have all those scrolls that make her look boxed in. And I think that's a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.